Everyone. Welcome back. It's time for Reading Ritual with Miss Carmen, and as always, I'm accompanied by Gus Duck up there and Susie May. I'm going to keep her right here on the keyboard. She'll be with us the whole time. I just don't have a place to hang her right now. As you know, I am in our soon to be finished building and we're under construction. So things change every so often, but I'm happy that you're back. We're going to continue reading The Secret Garden. We're about in the middle of chapter 4. But before I get started, I wanted to answer a question that someone sent me in a private message, but they were wondering, why am I doing these recordings of reading books? Well, there's a correlation, for me at least, between music and writing lyrics, which are typically stories set to music, and reading books and the words that are telling the stories. To me, it's part of the whole process. The more you read, the more you understand things and learn things, and the better you can be at writing or interpreting different songs. So that's why I continue to do that, and I'm very happy that you're joining me. So, where we were last week is Mary is now in England at her uncle's manor, and she just met Martha, who is one of the maids in the house. Not her personal maid like Mary is used to, but she will be helping her nonetheless. And Martha just suggested that she walk out into the sunshine and walk out into the garden. So let's continue where we left off. Mary had just discovered one of the kitchen gardens. Of course, she's looking for the secret garden, but we'll see how it turns out in this chapter. We'll read as far as we can go. Mary went through the door and found that it was a garden with walls all around it, and that was only one of the several walled gardens which seemed to open into one another. She saw another open green door, revealing bushes and pathways between beds containing winter vegetables. Fruit trees were trained flat against the wall, and over some of the beds there were glass frames. The place was bare and ugly enough, Mary thought, as she stood and stared about her. It might be nicer in summer when things were green, but there was nothing pretty about it now. Presently, an old man with a spade over his shoulder walked through the door leading from the second garden. He looked startled when he saw Mary and then touched his cap. He had a surly old face and did not seem at all pleased to see her, but then she was displeased with his garden and wore her quite contrary expression and certainly did not seem at all pleased to see him. "What is this place?" she asked. "One of the kitchen gardens," he answered. "What is that?" said Mary, pointing through the other green door. "Another of 'em. Shortly. There's another and another and another on this side of the wall, and there's the orchard on the other side of that." "Can I go in them?" asked Mary. "If the likes, but there's nothing to see." Mary made no response. She went down the path and through the second green door. There she found more walls and winter vegetables and glass frames, but in the second wall there was another green door, and it was not open. Perhaps it led into the secret garden, which no one had seen for 10 years. As she was not at all a timid child and always did what she wanted to do, Mary went to the green door and turned the handle. She hoped the door would not open because she wanted to be sure she had found the mysterious garden. But it did open quite easily, and she walked through it and found herself in an orchard. There were walls all around it also, and trees trained against them, and there were bare fruit trees growing in the winter-browned grass, but there was no green door to be seen anywhere. Mary looked for it, and yet when she had entered the upper end of the garden, she had noticed that the wall did not seem to end with the orchard, but to extend beyond it, as if enclosed a place at the other side. She could see the tops of trees above the wall, and when she stood still, she saw a bird with a bright red breast sitting on the topmost branch of one of them, and suddenly he burst into his winter song, almost as if he had caught sight of her and was calling to her. She stopped and listened to him, and somehow his cheerful, friendly little whistle gave her a pleased feeling. Even a disagreeable little girl may be lonely, and the big closed house and big bare moor and big bare gardens had made this one feel as if there were no one else left in the world but herself. If she had been an affectionate child who had been used to being loved, she would have had a broken heart. But even though she was Mistress Mary quite contrary, she was desolate, and the bright breasted little bird brought a look into her sour little face which was almost a smile. She listened to him until he flew away. He was not like an Indian bird, and she liked him and wondered if she should ever see him again. Perhaps he lived in the mysterious garden and knew all about it. Perhaps it was because she had nothing whatever to do that she thought so much of the deserted garden. She was curious about it and wanted to see what it was like. Why had Mr. Archibald Cravenberry the key? If he had liked his wife so much, why did he hate her garden? She wondered if she should ever see him, but she knew that if she did, she should not like him, and he would not like her, and that she would only stand and stare at him and say nothing, though she should be wanting dreadfully to ask him why he had done such a strange thing. People never like me, and I never like people, she thought. And I never can talk as the Crawford children could. They were always talking and laughing and making noises. She thought of the robin and the way he seemed to sing his song at her, and as she remembered the treetop he perched on, she stopped rather suddenly on the path. I believe that tree was in the secret garden. I feel sure it was, she said. There was a wall around the place, and there was no door. She walked back into the kitchen garden she had entered and found the old man digging there. She went and stood beside him and watched him a few moments in her cold little way. He took no notice of her, and so at last she spoke to him. I have been into the other gardens, she said. There was nothing to prevent thee, he answered crustily. I went into the orchard. There was no dog at the door to bite thee, he answered. There was no door there into the other garden, said Mary. What garden? He said in a rough voice, stopping his digging for a moment. The one on the other side of the wall, answered Mistress Mary. There are trees there. I saw the tops of them, and a bird with a red breast was sitting on one of them, and he sang. To her surprise, the surly old weather-beaten face actually changed his expression. A slow smile spread over it, and the gardener looked quite different. It made her think that it was curious how much nicer a person looked when he smiled. She had not thought of that before. He turned about to the orchard side of his garden and began to whistle, a low, soft whistle. She could not understand how such a surly man could make such a coaxing sound. Almost the next moment, a wonderful thing happened. She heard a soft little rushing flight through the air, and it was the bird with the red breast flying to them. And he actually alighted on the big clod of earth quite near to the gardener's foot. Here he is, chuckled the old man, and then he spoke to the bird as if he were speaking to a child. What has thee been there, you cheeky little beggar, he said. I've not seen thee before today. Has thee begun the courting this early in the season? Thou'rt too forward. The bird put his tiny head on one side and looked up at him with a soft, bright eye which was like a black dewdrop. He seemed quite familiar and not the least afraid. He hopped about and pecked the earth briskly, looking for seeds and insects. It actually gave Mary a nice feeling in her heart, because he was so pretty and cheerful and seemed so like a person. He had a tiny, plump body and a delicate beak and slender, delicate legs. Will he always come when you call him? She asked, almost in a whisper. Aye, that he will. I've known him ever since he was a fledgling. He came out of the nest in the other garden, and when first he flew over the wall, he was too weak to fly back. So for a few days we got friendly. When he went over the wall again, the rest of the brood was gone, and he was lonely, and he came back to me. What kind of a bird is he? Mary asked. Doesn't thou know? He's a robin redbreast, and they're the friendliest, curious birds alive. They're almost as friendly as dogs, if you know how to get on with them. Watch him pecking, and there looking around as he knows us again. He knows we're talking about him. It was the strangest thing in the world to see the old fellow. He looked at the plump little scarlet waistcoated bird as if he were both proud and fond of him. He's a conceited one, he chuckled. He likes to hear folks talk about him. And curious, bless me, there never has, there never was his like for curiosity and meddling. He was always coming to see what I'm planting. He knows all the things Mr. Craven never troubles himself to find out. He's the head gardener, he is. The robin hopped about, busily pecking the soil, and now and then stopped and looked at them a little. Mary thought his black dewdrop eyes gazed at her with great curiosity. It really seemed as if he were finding out all about her. The queer feeling in her heart increased. Where did the rest of the brood fly to? She asked. There's no knowing. The old ones return out of their nests, and they make 'em fly, and they're scattered before you know it. This one was knowing me, and he knew he was lonely. Mistress Mary went a step nearer to the robin and looked at him very hard. I'm lonely, she said. She had not known before that this was one of the things that made her feel sour and cross. She seemed to find out when the robin looked at her, and she looked at the robin. The old gardener pushed his cap back on his bald head and stared at her a minute. Ah, you're the little wench from India, he asked. Mary nodded. Then no wonder thou'rt lonely. That'll be lonelier before tha's done, he said. He began to dig, driving his spade deep into the rich black garden soil while the robin hopped about very busily employed. What is your name? Mary inquired. He stood up to answer her. Ben Weatherstaff, he answered, and then he added with a surly chuckle, I'm lonely myself, except when he's with me, and he jerked his thumb to the robin. He's the only friend I've got. I have no friends at all, said Mary. I never had. My ayah didn't like me, and I never played with anyone. It's a Yorkshire habit to say what you think with blunt frankness, and old Ben Weatherstaff was a Yorkshire moor man. Then me and you are a good bit alike, he said. We was wove out of the same cloth. We're neither of us good looking, and we're both of us sour as we look. We got the same nasty tempers, both of us, I'll warrant. This was plain speaking, and Mary Lennox had never heard the truth about herself in her life. Her previous servants always salaamed and submitted whatever she did. She had never thought much about her looks, but she wondered if she was as unattractive as Ben Weatherstaff, and she also wondered if she looked as sour as he had looked before the robin came. She actually began to wonder also if she was nasty-tempered. She felt uncomfortable. Suddenly, a clear, rippling little sound broke out near her, and she turned round. She was standing a few feet from a young apple tree, and the robin had flown on to one of its branches and had burst out into a scrap of a song. Ben Weatherstaff laughed outright. What did he do that for? Asked Mary. He's made up his mind to make friends with thee, replied Ben. Dang me if he hasn't took a fancy to thee. To me? Asked Mary, as she moved toward the little bird softly and looked up. Would you make friends with me? She said to the robin, just as if she were speaking to a person. Would you? And she did not say it either in her hard little voice or her imperious little Indian voice, but in a tone so soft and eager and coaxing that Ben Weatherstaff was as surprised as she had been when she heard him whistle. Why, he cried out, thou said that as nice a human as if you were a real child instead of a sharp old woman. Thou said it almost like Dickon talks to his wild things on the moor. Do you know Dickon? Mary asked, turning round rather in a hurry. Everybody knows him. Dickon's wandering about everywhere. The very blackberries and heatherbells knows him. I warrant the foxes show him where their cubs lies, and the skylarks don't hide their nests from him. Mary would have liked to have asked more questions. She was almost as curious about Dickon as she was about the deserted garden. But just that moment, the robin, who had ended his song, gave a little shake of his wings, spread them, and flew away. He had made his visit, and he had other things to do. "He's flown over the wall," Mary cried out, watching him. "He's flown into the orchard. He's flown across the other wall into the garden where there's no door." "He lives there," said Ben. "He came out of the egg there. If he's courtin', he's making up some young madam of a robin that lives He's making up to some young madam of a robin that lives among the old rose trees there." "Rose trees?" said Mary. "Are there rose trees?" Ben Weatherstaff took up his spade again and began to dig. "There was 10 year ago," he mumbled. "I should like to see them," said Mary. "Where's the green door? There must be a door somewhere." Ben drove his spade deep and looked as uncompanionable as he had looked when she had first seen him. "That was 10 year ago, but there isn't now," he said. "No door!" cried Mary. "There must be." "None as anyone can find, and none as is anyone's business. Don't you be a meddlesome wench and poke your nose where there's no cause to go. Here, I must go on with my work. Get on and play, you. I've got no more time." And he actually stopped digging, threw his spade over his shoulder, and walked off without even glancing at her or saying goodbye. Well, we figured out what happened in that little walk that she had, and I think we do have time for one more chapter. So we're going to go right into chapter 5, which is the cry in the corridor. There's Mary sitting at her windowsill. At first, each day which passed by for Mary Lennox was exactly like the others. Every morning she woke in her tapestried room and found Martha kneeling upon the hearth building her fire. Every morning she ate her breakfast in the nursery, which had nothing amusing in it, and after each breakfast she gazed out of the window across to the huge moor, which seemed to spread out on all sides and climb up to the sky. And after she had stared for a while, she realized that if she did not go out, she would have to stay in and do nothing, and so she went out. She did not know that this was the best thing she could have done, and she did not know that when she began to walk quickly, or even run along the paths and down the avenue, she was stirring her slow blood and making herself stronger by fighting with the wind which swept down from the moor. She ran only to make herself warm, and she hated the wind which rushed at her face and roared and held her back as if she were some giant that she could not see. But the big breaths of fresh air blown over the heather filled her lungs with something which was good for her whole thin body, and whipped some red color into her cheeks and brightened her dull eyes when she did not know anything about it. But after a few days spent almost entirely out of doors, she awakened one morning knowing what it was to be hungry. And when she sat down to her breakfast, she did not glance disdainfully at her porridge and push it away, but took up her spoon and began to eat it, and went on eating it until her bowl was empty. "That's got on well enough with that this morning, didn't it?" said Martha. "It tastes nice today," said Mary, feeling a little surprised herself. "It's the air of the moor that's given thee stomach for the victuals," answered Martha. "It's lucky for thee but that you've got the victuals as well as appetite. There have been 12 in one cottage, and had the stomach, and had nothing to put in it. You go on playing. You go outdoors every day, and you'll get some flesh on your bones, and you won't be so yeller." "I don't play," said Mary. "I have nothing to play with." "Nothing to play with!" exclaimed Martha. "Our children always play with sticks and stones. They just runs and shouts and looks at things." Mary did not shout, but she looked at things. There was nothing else to do. She walked round and round the gardens and wandered about the paths in the park. Sometimes she looked for Ben Weatherstaff, though several times she saw him at work. He was too busy to look at her, or was too surly. Once when she was walking toward him, he picked up his spade and turned away as if he did it on purpose. One place she went to oftener than any other. It was the long walk outside the gardens with the walls round them. There were bare flower beds on either side of it, and against the walls ivy grew thickly. There There was one part of the wall where the creeping dark green leaves were more bushy than elsewhere. It seemed as if for a long time that part had been neglected. The rest of it had been clipped and made to look neat, but this lower end of the walk, it had not been trimmed at all. A few days after she had talked to Ben Weatherstaff, Mary stopped to notice this and wondered why it was so. She had just paused and was looking up at a long spray of ivy swinging in the wind, and then she saw a gleam of scarlet and heard a brilliant chirp. And there, on top of the wall, perched Ben Weatherstaff's robin redbreast, tilting forward to look at her with his small head on one side. "Oh!" she cried out. "Is it you? Is it you?" And it did not seem at all strange to her that she spoke to him as if she were sure he would understand and answer her. He did answer, actually. He twittered and chirped and hopped all along the wall as if he were telling her all sorts of things. It seemed to Mistress Mary as if she understood him, too, though he was not speaking in words. It was as if he said, "Good morning. Isn't the wind nice? Isn't the sun nice? Isn't everything nice? Let us both chirp and hop and twitter. Come on, come on." Mary began to laugh, and as he hopped and took little flights along the wall, she ran after him. Poor little thin, sallow, ugly Mary actually looked almost pretty for a moment. I like you," she cried out, pattering down the walk, and she chirped and she tried to whistle, which she did not quite know how to do in the least. But the robin seemed to be quite satisfied and chirped and whistled back at her. At last he spread his wings and made a darting flight to the top of a tree, where he perched and sang loudly. He had been That reminded Mary of the first time she had seen him. He had been swinging on a treetop then, and she had been standing in the orchard. Now she was on the other side of the orchard and standing in the path outside a wall, much lower down, and there was the same green tree inside. "It's in the garden no one can go into," she said to herself. "It's the garden without a door. He lives in there. How I wish I could see what it's like." She ran up the walk to the green door she had entered the first morning. Then she ran down the path through the other door and then into the orchard. When she stood and looked up, there was a tree on the other side of the wall, and there was a robin just finishing up his song and beginning to preen his feathers with his beak. "It is the garden," she said. "I am sure it is." She walked round and looked closely at that side of the orchard wall, but she only found what she had found before, that there was no door in it. Then she ran through the kitchen gardens again and ran into the walk outside the long ivy-covered wall, and she walked to the end of it and looked at it, but there was no door. And then she walked to the other end, looking again, but there was still no door. "It's very strange," she said. "Ben Weatherstaff said there was no door, and there is no door, but there must have been one over 10 years ago because Mr. Craven buried the key." This gave her so much to think of that she began to be quite interested and feel that she was not sorry she had come to Misselthwaite Manor. In India, she had always felt hot and too languid to care much about anything. The fact was that the fresh wind from the moor had begun to blow the cobwebs out of her young brain and to waken her up a little. She stayed out of doors nearly all day, and when she sat down to her supper at night, she felt hungry and drowsy and comfortable. She did not feel cross when Martha chattered away. She felt as if she rather liked to hear her, and at last she thought she would ask her a question. She asked it after she finished her supper and had sat down on the hearthrug before the fire. "Why did Mr. Craven hate the garden?" she said. She had made Martha stay with her, and Martha had not objected at all. She was very young, and used to a crowded cottage full of brothers and sisters, and she found it dull in the great servants' hall downstairs, where the footmen and upper housemaids made fun of her Yorkshire speech, and looked upon her as a common little thing, and they sat and whispered amongst themselves. Martha liked to talk, and the strange child who had lived in India had been waited upon the servants was a novelty enough to attract her. She sat down on the hearth herself without waiting to be asked. "Art thou thinking about that garden yet?" she said. "I knew thou would, and that was just the way with me when I first heard about it." "Why does he hate it?" Mary persisted. Martha tucked her feet under her and made herself quite comfortable. Listen to the wind wuthering round the house, she said. You can barely stand up on the moor if you was out there tonight. Mary did not know what wuthering meant until she listened, and then she understood. It must mean that the hollow shuddering, sort of a roar, which rushed round and round the house, as if the giant no one could see was buffeting it and beating at the walls and windows trying to break in. But one knew he could not get in, and somehow it made one feel very safe and warm inside a room with a red coal fire. So here's a picture of Mary and Martha sitting on the hearthrug talking about the garden and the wind. Why did he hate it so? Then Martha gave up her store of knowledge. Mind, she said, Mrs. Medlock said it's not to be talked about. There's lots of things in this place that's not to be talked about. That's Mr. Craven's orders. His troubles are none of the servant's business, he says, but for the garden he wouldn't be like he is. It was Mrs. Craven's garden that she had made when they were first married, and she just loved it. And they used to tend the flowers themselves, and none of the gardeners were ever let to go in. Him and her used to go in and shut the door and stay there for hours and hours reading and talking. And as she was just a bit of a girl, and there was an old tree with a branch on it, bent like a seat on it, and she made roses grow over it, and she used to sit there. But one day, when she was sitting there, the branch broke, and she fell on the ground and was hurt so bad that the next day she died. The doctor thought he'd go out of his mind and die too. That's why he hates it. No one has ever gone in since, and he won't let anyone talk about it. Mary did not ask any more questions. She looked at the red fire and listened to the wind wuthering. It seemed to be wuthering louder than ever. At that moment, a very good thing was happening to her. 4 good things had happened to her, in fact, since she came to Misselthwaite Manor. She had felt as if she understood a robin and that he understood her. She had run in the wind until her blood had grown warm. She had been healthily hungry for the first time in her life. And she finally found out what it was like to feel sorry for someone. But as she was listening to the wind, she began to listen to something else. She did not know what it was because at first she could hardly distinguish it from the wind herself. It was a curious sound. It seemed almost as if a child were crying somewhere. Sometimes the wind sounded rather like a child crying, but presently Mistress Mary felt quite sure this sound was inside the house, not outside. It was far away, but it was inside. She turned round and looked at Martha. "Do you hear anyone crying?" she said. Martha suddenly looked confused. "No," she answered. It's the wind. Sometimes it sounds as if someone was lost on the moor and wailing. It's got all sorts of sounds." "But listen," said Mary. "It's in the house, down one of those long corridors." And at that very moment a door must have opened somewhere downstairs, for a great rushing draught blew along the passage, and the door of the room they sat in was blown open with a crash, and they both jumped to their feet. The light was blown out, and the crying sound was swept down the far corridor so that it was to be heard more plainly than ever. "There!" said Mary. "I told you so. It's someone crying, and it isn't a grown-up person." Martha ran and shut the door and turned the key, but before she did it, they both heard the sound of a door in some far passage shutting with a bang, and then everything was quiet, for even the wind ceased wuthering for a few moments. "It was the wind," said Martha stubbornly, "and if it wasn't, then it was little Betty Butterworth, the scullery maid. She's had a toothache all day." But something troubled and awkward in her manner made Mistress Mary stare very hard at her. She did not believe she was speaking the truth. All right, then, we finished half of chapter 4 and all of chapter 5, and we are getting into some very curious things that are happening at Misselthwaite Manor. I'm so happy that you've joined us for Reading Ritual, and I'm really happy when you share our stories and our reading moments. So if you like, in the thread below, I'll be posting some information. We're working on some really special programs with different authors and different books from as far away as Arizona and Tennessee. We've got some special projects in the works. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next time on Reading Ritual with Miss Carmen. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, or a great evening, or a great afternoon. Bye.